These days, GPUs seem to just be getting more and more expensive, with prices of even more mid-range cards like the 4070 Ti being basically $1,000. Gamers that want a good bang for their buck have run out of options for new GPUs. However, what about used GPUs? Today's card on the chopping block for testing and evaluation is the GTX 1080 Ti, an unlikely king of budget GPUs. Yes, you heard me right. I am calling a 1080 Ti budget now, the reason for which will become rather apparent later on in the review. Starting off, of course, we got the specs of this nice hybrid EVGA example. The 1080 Ti has a whopping 3,584 CUDA cores on the TSMC 16nm process. It uses the same die as the Titan XP, in fact. With a large die, it was built to go fast. Something interesting is that the 1080 Ti isn't the first example of NVIDIA making a Titan that's only slightly cut down. NVIDIA, with the 980 Ti, did the same thing. And in fact, it was cut down by the same number of CUDA cores versus the Titan X, 256. It also has a ludicrous amount of VRAM, coming in at 11 gigs, only 1 gig less than the Titan XP. So coming in with a base clock of 1,481 MHz and a boost of 1,582 MHz, she is gonna roar. The Founders Edition of the 1080 Ti had a 6-pin and 8-pin for powering it up to its 250-watt TDP. But this EVGA card has dual 8 pins. Anyways, I think that is enough blabbering about the specs. It's time to see how it performs. The system I will be using to benchmark this card today is my main rig, which has a Ryzen 7 5800X3D with 32 gigabytes of 3000 MHz DDR4 with my shiny new 1440p monitor, so we can give the 1080 Ti as good of a shot possible in the benchmarks today. To make comparisons more interesting, I'll be testing my 2080 Ti alongside the 1080 Ti to show an important aspect at the end of the review. The graph itself also has to be enlarged to better show the FPS that both of these cards are capable of. The results from the 2080 Ti will have purple bars. I'm going to be testing the same games as was done for the RX 580 review, as I think it's good to give y'all the most important information possible about just what the 1080 Ti can do. Starting off, we have Vivecraft, a mod that adds VR to Java Minecraft. We see performance that is identical to my 2080 Ti, with 81 FPS on average, with lows that are still plenty playable at 44 FPS. Elite Dangerous also performed very well, only being a little bit slower than the 2080 Ti, coming in at 63 FPS on average, with very good lows, making for a very smooth experience. Bone Lab stuck out here and actually ran significantly worse than I was expecting, given the results so far, with a not so great 46 FPS on average. It made playing this shooter zone here rather difficult, with the FPS being as low as it was. Dirt Rally 2.0 ran about where I was expecting, with 35 FPS on average, with very consistent lows at 29 FPS. This low of a frame rate made driving fast tough. However, dropping down to high would help significantly, so that is really what I would recommend doing instead. Last up for the VR titles, we got VR Chat, which, very surprisingly, was actually bottlenecked by the GPU, with 67 FPS on average, but lows being nearly identical to the 2080 Ti with 52 FPS. So that goes to show the Ryzen 7 5800X3D kicks butt in VR Chat apparently. Who would have thunk? Anyways, now with that done, we can see how the 1080 Ti does with flat panel games. Crossout ended up running well, not as fast as the 2080 Ti, but still plenty fast enough, with 167 FPS on average, with a tad bit distant lows, and 112 FPS. BeamNG also ran frickin' great, with 95 FPS on average, with still totally epic lows coming in at 70 FPS. Rocket League ran so stupendously quick that there's almost no point in making a comparison, with 339 FPS on average, and still stupid high lows at 153. Some of these lighter titles just run insanely fast, and that's still at 1440p. No Man's Sky also ran very well with 89 FPS on average. It was an experience that I simply could not complain about. Ovorian ran functionally identically to the 2080 Ti, meaning a CPU bottleneck again, with 116 FPS on average, with lows identical at 58 FPS. When it comes to the late game, where I do my benchmarks, Ovorian really likes a fast CPU, not so much an amazing GPU. Cyberpunk 2077 ran acceptably with 48 FPS on average, but with some nastier lows coming down to 33 FPS versus the 2080 Ti. Do note, though, that this was still at the Ultra preset at 1440p, so rather impressive stuff. Shadow of the Tomb Raider also ran great, funnily enough, with 80 FPS on average, and was very smooth and really, really nice to play. Doom Eternal ran frickin' awesome as well, with 170 FPS on average. Although, even with the game performing that well, it didn't make me any better at Doom. Last up for today, we got the Halo Master Chief Collection, which was CPU bottlenecked as both the 1080 Ti and 2080 Ti performed identically with 179 FPS on average, but with ever so slightly worse lows at 139 FPS. Whew! Wow-wee, that was a lot of games to test, honestly. The reason why I kept in the games that were bottlenecked by my CPU was to mainly show that even really good and awesome games, even at such high frame rates, could still be bottlenecked by the CPU. And of course, now it's time for me to spill why I threw in my 2080 Ti for the benchmarks today. Well, that's because the 1080 Ti on eBay right this very moment is only $240. In fact, if you look around on Facebook Marketplace, which is basically the modern day Craigslist, I managed to snag this EVGA example, minus the radiator fan, for just $140. And the 2080 Ti? That'll still set you back $450 on eBay. And I paid $950 for mine just only a little over a year ago. That is insane! The FPS per dollar, if you want to use such a metric like that, is incredibly high for the 1080 Ti, which is why I call it the Budget King. Anyways, I got a couple of thoughts that I want to get out before I close out the video. Honestly, after those benchmarks, I'm kind of still in shock with how well the 1080 Ti performed for just how little I paid for it. This thing can sustain 1950 MHz on core, and I can max out the VRAM overclock slider to 1 GHz, and it will still be stable. Although, because it's Pascal, that only nets an FPS gain of about 3 FPS. The only two things I don't like about it are its massive size, especially given it's a hybrid card, and a driver issue that won't be fixed that causes any 10 series card to suck back around 65 watts whenever it's idle when connected to a high refresh rate screen. NVIDIA already fixed this bug for 20 series and newer, but they didn't decide to fix it for the 10 series. A bit of a bummer there, but not the end of the world. When compared to the 3060 Ti, The 1080 Ti still makes more sense, as it is still $80 cheaper. All you lose is ray tracing and DLSS, which doesn't really matter too much to me, and I wouldn't consider it a big selling point unless you are gaming at higher resolutions like 1440p and 4K, which if you are picking up a card for this little money, that will be the case for most people anyway. The whole reason why I got this GPU in the first place is to somehow shove it in my external graphics card dock for my laptop to turn it into a VR gaming beast when I end up doing some intercontinental traveling sometime this year. Well, that's it. If you wonderful folks enjoyed today's video, make sure to show your support by hitting the like and subscribe buttons, as well as that bell so you never miss another upload from me. And I once again apologize for the long gap in between uploads. Still struggling with drive to do things. That's all. Anyways, DDT out.